It wasn't meant to. Good evening and welcome. I'm Jane Frances Kelly, Director of the David Hume Institute. I want to start this evening by thanking investment managers Baillie Gifford for their sponsorship of this evening. Their support of our efforts to make an evidence-based, impartial contribution to the Scottish policy landscape is very much appreciated. The last of our autumn series of seminars takes place a week tomorrow, on the 21st of November, when Michael Keating and Richard Wynne-Jones, this is maybe the time to remind you all, will compare Scottish and Welsh perspectives on Brexit. They'll be looking at the major challenges Brexit poses to the 1999 devolution settlements, the role of the devolved governments in the negotiations, the allocation of competencies currently shared with Europe, the argument about consent for Brexit legislation, and other thorny issues. That seminar will take place at Argyll House on Castle Terrace, now headquarters of Codebase, Britain's largest startup incubator. In January, we'll see the return of the Politicians and Professionals series, when we'll hear from the leaders of each of Scotland's main political parties. Keep an eye out in your inboxes for details between now and the end of the year. And I want to thank David Hume Institute member Anne Sibbald for all her work on helping organise the series. Now to turn to the business of this evening. A month or so ago, the former chair of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, Christina Romer, spoke at a David Hume Institute event about the aftermath of financial crises. She noted that some crises, such as Norway's in the early 90s, are followed by only small recessions, while others, such as Japan's in the 90s or Greece's more recently, are followed by the kind of severe and prolonged economic distress that can blight lives. I've only recently in my life had any insight into how restricting and demoralising economic insecurity can be, and it may be that some of you sitting in the audience this evening have escaped the debilitating effects of that kind of economic insecurity. But those of you who have had some experience of it will appreciate all the more how fortunate we are to hear this evening from someone who was at the centre of economic management at really the most important time in recent memory. Nick Macpherson was Permanent Secretary to the UK Treasury from 2005 to 2016. He served under 3 Chancellors and managed the department through the financial crisis, which began in 2007. He was knighted in 2009, and in 2016 was created a life peer as Baron Macpherson of Earl's Court. After Nick speaks, the David Hume Institute's chair, Sir John Elvidge, will moderate questions from the audience, and at 7:30, we'll all have a drink. Nick is going to speak about economic policy making in a UK outside of the EU. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. And can I also thank the sponsors, Baillie Gifford, very fine people. I'm going to talk about where we are on Brexit and try and make sense of the strange situation we find ourselves in, and then go on to think through what the economic policy response should be to those circumstances. Leaving the European Union represents the biggest change in Britain's role in the world in 60 years, and it's going to happen in 501 days' time. I want to set out what this will mean for the economy and for economic policy, and what government should be seeking to do now to minimise the risks and maximise the opportunities. I do not want to rerun the arguments of the 2016 referendum. The decision has been taken. But it is one thing to decide to leave the European Union. It's another to determine the destination, the final resting point outside the EU. Political campaigning is all about difference. The advocates of Brexit could paint an attractive picture where we got our country back, our borders would be controlled, more money would be available for the NHS, and judges in London and Edinburgh would be the ultimate arbiter of the law rather than the court in Luxembourg. But the one thing I learned from 30 years working in the Treasury was that the prose of governing is rather more heavy-going than the poetry of the campaign trail. As a medium-sized and very open economy, the UK cannot opt out of the international economic system. Any deal will involve a considerable amount of compromise. Having seen at first hand how the British government engaged with Iceland and Ireland during the financial crisis, I'm all too aware that larger entities tend to get the better of smaller entities. In this respect, at least, Thrasymachus' claim in Book 1 of Plato's Republic still resonates. Might is right. Whether our politicians have prepared us for the likely endgame, I shall leave to others to judge. It's easy to criticise the government for triggering Article 50 before it had forged a national consensus on Britain's future relationship with the EU and others. And people I meet from mainland Europe tend to be puzzled that 16 months on from the referendum, the Prime Minister seems to spend rather more time negotiating with her cabinet colleagues than with the European Council. Predicting the final outcome on Brexit is a mug's game, but it's a game which businesses who either trade regularly with the EU or who employ EU labour are already having to play, like it or not. First, there is the possibility, beloved by Mr. Redwood and others, of refusing to do a deal. Instead, we would simply leave the European Union no later than the expiry of the 2-year deadline provided for in Article 50. We would not pay the EU a penny, and we would rely on World Trade Organization terms to look after our interests. There is superficial attraction in this. For many goods, WTO terms do not involve particularly high tariffs, though for others, in particular agriculture, they do. But tariffs are the easy part. It's the issue of standards which is more difficult. It will not be enough for British exporters to assert their goods conform with the relevant standards. The EU will need to recognise that conformity, and that will require a plethora of mutual recognition agreements of the sort the EU has with the United States. The WTO is also notoriously quiet on services, which account for the vast majority of the UK's GDP. And of course, if the EU feels that the UK is reneged on paying its dues, it's unlikely to make trading with it easy. The fact is, the WTO provides no more than a platform on which states build bilateral and multilateral agreements to provide for better market access. WTO terms on their own are distinctly uninviting, which is why so many countries try to avoid them. It's no coincidence that the countries with whom the EU trades on WTO terms are few and far between. Yemen and Venezuela come to mind. Here, advocates of no deal argue that the UK has a big deficit in trade in goods with the EU, and so German car manufacturers, amongst others, will force their governments to come crawling back to the negotiating table. This may happen, but I fear that it won't. The fact is, the UK's exports to the EU account for 13% of our national income, while the EU's exports to the UK account for just 3% of the EU's national income. We simply aren't important enough. I'm a rationalist, and for that reason, I still think that the balance of probability still points to a negotiated deal leading to a hard Brexit, by which I mean the UK will still leave the customs union and the single market. That is, after all, the stated policy of the government. And although the main opposition party is rather more emollient, it has yet to commit to a different course. In EU argot, the UK will become a third country, necessitating border checks of some sort both at Calais and closer to home on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Under this scenario, the only question is when the hard border comes into effect. Will there be a transition, and if so, how long will it last? In principle, a transition could last a long time. Its legal base will be tricky. The easiest base would be to extend the Article 50 period beyond 2 years and effectively stay in the EU. But that is likely to be seen as betrayal by supporters of Brexit. The alternative, which no doubt the government will seek to pursue in the months ahead, is some sort of afterlife in the single market and customs union after we have left the EU. I am told this presents a number of obstacles, in particular in relation to trade with other countries outside the EU, and of course the agreement would have to be ratified by all 27 member states. But let's assume the government gets what it wants, which is an ambitious free trade agreement with the EU, something along the lines of the EU's free trade deal with Canada. That will certainly put the UK in a better position than a no-deal WTO scenario. The Canada model provides some provision for services that it would leave asset managers and banks well short of the access they get under the single market. And it will leave a border of varying hardness with the EU. Even Norway, which is a member of the European Economic Area, which we won't be, is subject to rules of origin checks. Against that, we will be able to negotiate our own trade deals, the reason why the government is so keen to leave the customs union. I'm quite certain that some of these deals will be better than the status quo. Others will be harder going, in particular with the United States, which tends to see trade policy as an instrument of US hegemony. So you can look forward to lots of debates about chlorinated chicken and steroids in your beef. However, there is a reason why so much of our trade is with the EU: proximity. Modern supply chains tend to be regionalised, enabling just-in-time delivery and low inventories, and trade with the rest of the world tends to start from a low base. For example, the last year, the UK exported as much in goods to Ireland as it did to Japan, South Korea, Australia, and India put together. And the previous year, the UK exported more than 3 times as much in services to Ireland as it did to China. My guess is that sometime around 2030, the UK will find a new equilibrium. It will be outside the European Union, but it will not be very different from where we are now. We were never properly in the European Union. We weren't in the single currency, nor in the Schengen area. We have opted out of both rights and responsibilities. But the intervening period will be one of uncertainty and disruption. The British economy will continue to grow, it generally does, but it will grow more slowly. I've never been one of those who think the British economy will fall off a cliff as a result of Brexit. That if the government plays its cards badly, there could be the odd shock along the way, with air traffic grounded and lorries backing up from Dover around the M25. More likely, the economy will just grow a little slower, driven partly by lower immigration, but mainly by lower productivity and living standards. We may already be seeing this, with investment growing slowly, if at all. Swati Dhingra and others at the Centre of Economic Performance at the LSE have estimated the long-term cost of Brexit at 6.3 to 9.4% of GDP once the dynamic consequences for trade, foreign direct investment and productivity are taken into account. The Treasury estimated the cost in 2016 at 6.2%, assuming a negotiated trade agreement. I see no reason to think these estimates as exaggerated and would expect them to play out in living standards rising by 1/4 to 0.5% less a year than they otherwise would have done over the next decade or so. The impact will be barely perceptible year by year, but the cumulative effect will be considerable, as will the opportunity cost in terms of revenue foregone. The upper end of the LSE estimate would leave revenues £70 billion a year lower. But let's be optimistic and assume fashionably that the experts have got it wrong. Let's suppose there is a relatively small transitional impact on national income of just 0.25% a year for 12 years. That would still leave revenues £20 billion lower a year in perpetuity. That is one reason, in my view, why it would be good economics for the British government to put more money on the table now as a one-off payment to secure a better trade deal with the EU, the better to improve incomes and revenues year after year in the decades ahead. It is just about conceivable that as the consequences of Brexit become clear, the British people will turn against it and the government will put a stop to it. As Lord Kerr pointed out last week, we can change our minds at any stage during the Article 50 process. But the solidity of the Tory-DUP alliance makes this implausible. Far more likely, the consequences will become clear only when we have left the EU, and then it will be too late. As Lord Kerr also pointed out, once a country is out, return will be difficult and there will be a price to pay. And so, like it or not, we need to face up to life outside. The question which I will now turn to, is what is the right economic policy response for the times ahead? First, in my view, the government needs to accept that macroeconomic policy is likely to have little impact on growth. The Bank of England will need to set monetary policy to achieve the inflation target. It raised interest rates 10 days ago for the first time in a decade, rightly in my view. It was reasonable to loosen policy in the light of the referendum result, and the fall in sterling has helped ensure Britain has remained competitive at a time when the Eurozone economy has been growing rapidly. However, we are currently at full employment, and it is important that the markets don't get the impression that the authorities will always let sterling take the strain. That is the road to inflationary ruin. Quantitative easing provides a large overhang of loose policy, which has inflated asset prices. The bank understandably makes a fetish of precision and has been studiously reinvesting the proceeds of gilts, which have matured. But I'm encouraged by recent remarks from the bank which suggest that they may end this practice sooner rather than later. At a time of political uncertainty and weak government, it's particularly important that our independent economic institutions provide a policy lead. I'm optimistic that the bank will demonstrate its commitment to sound money. For all the talk of policy tightness, the same cannot be said for fiscal policy. Since the election, the government has shown itself remarkably reluctant to take tough decisions on how new spending commitments will be paid for. The Conservative Party dropped a number of sensible ideas to rein in public spending in pursuing its alliance with the Democratic Unionist Party. Perhaps most important of all was its dropping of its electoral promise to end the triple lock on pensions, one of the greatest sources of pressure on the public finances and the biggest contributor to intergenerational inequality. Since the election, the government has made a number of new spending commitments, for example, on housing and Brexit planning. It is not made clear how these spending commitments will be paid for. Mr. Hammond may put this right in his budget in 10 days' time, but since he found it impossible to enact a perfectly sensible proposal to reduce the national insurance subsidy to the self-employed when he had a majority in Parliament, I'm not optimistic. In the short run, revenues have held up reasonably well, helped by debt-financed consumption and good export sales to Europe. But with real wages falling, it seems unlikely that revenues will hold up indefinitely. And so there will be no alternative to bring public spending growth more into line with growth in the economy. Debt has been rising as a percentage of national income for 15 years. This year, it is likely to reach 88% of GDP. There's nothing magic about debt dynamics, but once debt reaches this sort of level, the public finances become increasingly vulnerable to an increase in the interest rate at which the government borrows. So far, that rate has been flattered by quantitative easing and the glut of global savings. With Britain leaving the European Union, the markets are likely to pay greater attention to whether the government has a credible economic policy. And now that the Bank of England is independent, we can no longer rely on inflation to wipe out the debt, as it did in the 1970s and 1980s. For all the talk of austerity, it is worrying that 8 years into an economic recovery, debt is still rising, and that we are running one of the loosest fiscal policies in Europe. But there are two wider problems about the current approach to public finances. First, there's too much consumption and not enough investment. And with demographic pressures likely to increase over the coming decade on pensions, the NHS, and long-term care, there will be further pressures to spend more on consumption. Secondly, much of the fiscal retrenchment has been at the expense of the young, who will not only receive smaller occupational pensions, but are expected to pay higher taxes to pay for the pensions of the current retired generation. I need to be careful here because I see a number of people in the room who may just be in receipt of their retirement pension. But this is particularly unfair given that poverty is now more prevalent among the working age population than among pensioners. It was striking that the only policy proposal in the main party's manifestos designed to address intergenerational inequality was rapidly dropped when it came under pressure in last year's election. But at some point, some party is going to have to address this issue. And perhaps with young people voting in much greater numbers at the last election, the pendulum will begin to swing in their favour. In the end, the only thing which can offset the likely reduction in growth which will result from Brexit is supply-side policy. This is going to be more important than ever in the years ahead, but it is an area where successive governments have been better at talking. Rarely a year goes by without a new growth or industrial strategy than delivering. There is no magic answer to increasing productive potential. Rather, it requires persistence, consistency, consensus, and hard work. Moreover, since many of the supply-side instruments available are devolved, there is scope for the different countries of the United Kingdom to adopt different policies and priorities and provide better evidence of what works and what doesn't. A good place to start is public investment. As I said earlier, I'd like to see more investment by the public sector and less consumption, but the quality of that investment is of critical importance. The Treasury has had some success in recent years in ranking potential investment projects by their economic return, but all too often, investment decisions hinge on prestige and presentation. It's easier to paint exciting pictures of high-speed trains or even a garden bridge than a more prosaic road bypass. But often, it is the bypass which has the highest economic return. Investment decisions need to be made in a long-term context and to complement and reinforce each other. The setting up of the Infrastructure Commission in Whitehall is, in my view, already making for better decision-making. Historically, the cost of building a mile of road in the UK has been higher than in mainland Europe. That needs to change. Some of this is about the planning regime, and the planning regime has also militated against house building. Again, there have been some moves towards a more supply-side friendly approach to planning in recent years, but there is more to do. The cost of housing is one of the greatest obstacles to growth in the UK, and that is as true in Edinburgh as it is in London, and as relevant to growth in the Isle of Skye as it is in the Isle of Wight. The Westminster government has released more resources for house building recently, but the number of houses this will finance is pitifully small. The public sector and local authorities in particular need to take the strain. Last year, 170,000 housing units were built across the UK. It may be unrealistic to return to the Wilson era, when in 1968 as many as 428,000 houses were built across the UK, but to return to the 220,000 a year average of the Thatcher era would be a start. That even that would not be enough to address the growth in household formation. And if the housing market is going to perform better, it's not just enough to improve the supply side. We need to improve the demand side too. Transactions taxes like stamp duty and the land and building transactions tax here in Scotland are about the least efficient way of raising revenue that can be imagined. I was not remotely surprised when revenues from stamp duty on properties over £1 million fell in England, Wales and Northern Ireland last year. Holyrood and Westminster should follow the Irish example and reduce tax rates on buying a house and replace the shortfall with an annual property tax based on values. This would encourage a more efficient use of the housing stock. But alongside more investment and lower public consumption, we need to see a step change in skills. This is partly about the education system. Literacy and numeracy across the countries of the UK tends to lag our competitors. But it's also about technical education and support provided by government and employers to develop the skills of those who don't go to university. This is going to be particularly important if the UK government succeeds in its objective of reducing migration from Central and Eastern Europe, which has been critical to Britain's economic performance since the turn of the century. Successive governments, both in London and Edinburgh, have announced radical reforms to the skills system. I always say, whenever I heard the word radical reform when I was working in government, my heart sank. Sadly, taking a really long period, like 100 years, those radical changes have made little difference. More than any other area, this is one which requires persistence and consensus building rather than rearranging the deck chairs every few years. The skills system needs to be more demand-led and employers more actively involved, as in continental Europe. Decisions need to be devolved to a local level rather than imposed from London or Edinburgh. Sadly, when it comes to skills, our political class don't show much staying power, nor does our media. As Tony Blair used to say, if you want to keep something secret, announce something in a debate on skills and training in the House of Commons. But even if a sustained improvement in skills can be achieved, the lead times are likely to necessitate a relatively open approach to migration for some years to come. This is particularly true of the science and technology sectors, where historically the UK has had a comparative advantage. Leaving the EU will result in a reduction in funding for science. It will be important that the British taxpayer not only makes a difference, but that the government prioritise expenditure on science and innovation. This is not about backing winners, but it is about ensuring that British universities maintain a cutting-edge research base, the better to enable the commercial development of ideas. Securing higher growth and productivity will also require a ruthless approach to competition. When I joined the Treasury in the early 1980s, government was still wasting large sums of money on supporting low productivity champions like British Leyland or unsuccessful inward investors like DeLorean. I don't think anybody is proposing to return to the industrial intervention of those days, but government needs to ensure a complete level playing field between challengers and incumbents, not least to protect the interests of the consumer. As an official, I always found the EU state aid rules hugely helpful in seeing off wasteful ideas. I hope the government will seek to embed some equivalent to the state aid regime in domestic legislation. And if we are to raise the UK's growth rate, it will be important to ensure that the tax regime remains competitive. Leaving the European Union will mean that companies will no longer see the UK as a market-friendly gateway to one of the biggest markets in the world. That means the tax regime for capital and labour will become more important in investment decisions. Governments have prioritised reductions in the main corporation tax rate. Corporation tax has fallen from, that rate's fallen from 33% in 1997 to 19% this year, and is set to fall to 17% in 2020. It may be necessary to go further. Equally, it will be important to ensure that the marginal income tax rates remain competitive. There are indications that the French are wanting to create a more competitive tax regime. If Edinburgh, Glasgow and London are going to remain competitive with Paris, our governments cannot afford to increase the tax burden further. If anything, the contrary. That does not mean Britain has to turn into Singapore. The real preference of the British people is that they want European levels of public services. But it does mean that we need political leadership on the trade-offs and choices facing the electorate. I would like to finish with some brief observations on Brexit's implications for Scotland. Clearly, there are specific issues around agriculture, forestry and fisheries which I hope can be resolved satisfactorily. Ideally, Scotland would be able to determine its own approach to migration, since demographic pressures are very different from those in England, which is dominated by the South East. But despite efforts by the Scottish Government to get a special deal for this country, it seems inevitable that Scotland will be leaving the EU on exactly the same terms as England and Wales. On the plus side, Scotland has many of the tools at its disposal to improve the supply side which are available to Westminster. It too has the choice to invest more and consume less, to improve education and skills, and so on. I haven't detected much enthusiasm of late for another referendum in Scotland, and I don't feel qualified to opine about the merits of independence. Suffice it to say, if it does happen, Scotland will have to consider whether or not to rejoin the EU and on what terms. If it were to rejoin, I would expect the border between the Republic and Northern Ireland to provide a template for the Scotland-England border. I would be surprised if it was frictionless. Against that, Scotland would be able to trade freely by sea with 27 EU member states. It will also be necessary to consider what an optimal economic policy would be for an independent Scotland. As I say, this is, of course, all hypothetical. However, as I've said before, recent events provide a golden opportunity for proponents of independence to reappraise their economic prospectus. First, on the currency, I strongly believe that monetary union with the rest of the UK would not be in Scotland's interests. And in any case, I can't see the UK government agreeing to it in the future, having ruled it out so conclusively in 2014. And so I see no alternative, at least in the early years of hypothetical independence, to Scotland maintaining its own currency and allowing it to float freely against sterling and the euro. That way the Scottish pound could find the right level, which would be determined, at least in part, by where the world is in the oil price cycle. Small countries can be very successful. Ireland is proof of that. But to realise those potential benefits, economic policy has to be credible. I would advise in those hypothetical circumstances any Scottish government to aim broadly to balance the budget. At present, without support from Westminster, Scotland would be running a large deficit. If the proponents of independence want to increase their economic credibility, now is the time to start setting out how that deficit could be closed. And it will also be important to consider how best to establish a competitive and efficient corporate and personal tax regime, the better to attract capital and skills. So, I am in no doubt that leaving the European Union will create challenges for all the countries of the UK. We need to face up to its inevitability, and we need to accept it will impact on trade and living standards. But if the government in London, and indeed in Edinburgh, can put in place the right economic policies and stick to them, not just for a year, but for a decade or two, it should be possible to limit any permanent damage. Indeed, if Brexit results in better economic policy making, there may yet be a silver lining. Thank you.
Well, Nick had said in advance that he wanted to be particularly generous to you in terms of the amount of time that he would leave over for questions, and he's been absolutely true to his word. So we have an unusually ample time to explore the range of questions that you might want to ask, and Nick has given you an exceptionally broad range of issues on which you might wish to ask questions. So we'll do the usual thing. We'll take questions in bunches of three. If people would say who they are when they're asking questions, that would help. And over to you. Who wants to go first? Please. If you just hang on a second for the mic to arrive.
Thank you. Eleanor Emberson from the Scottish Government. You mentioned the need to keep tax burden down, and also the appetite of the population for a European-style level of public spending and public services, and you said that would need political leadership. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little.
Okay, couple more. You're not usually... excellent, thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris Carr, Edinburgh Business School. Just a couple on that last throwaway one in respect to Scotland. Do you not think that with the situation in Catalonia, Madrid would just veto Scotland for the EU? And secondly, if you happily float an independent Scottish currency, there is a real danger of capital loss for anyone with pensions or houses just on that currency fluctuation, which is fairly scary for some people. But then on the political situation, on the main issue, do you not think that the very conservative assessment you've made assumes that the hardish Brexit will not be voted down in the House of Commons in a no confidence?
Okay, who wants to be the last one on this first vote? Thank you. Just over there on the aisle.
David Gow from Social Europe and Sceptical Scot. I was going to ask precisely on that point. Your whole thesis seems to me to bend very much on what you call the solidity of the DUP-Tory alliance, continuing, as it were, not in perpetuity, but for some considerable time. I mean, seen from here, this doesn't look, well, first of all, the Tory alliance itself doesn't look pretty solid. The alliance with the DUP doesn't look that solid either. I mean, because you're also assuming there will be a hard Brexit, and therefore that must mean outside the customs union and the single market, must mean a hard border between north and south of the island of Ireland. So therefore, in that case, the DUP will not be rather solid with the Conservative Party at all. So are you just assuming that there will be this kind of drift of the current government will sort of go on forever, and that everybody will be so frightened of Jeremy Corbyn and quotes the Marxist state that there will be no change of government?
Well, those are some fantastic questions, which, I could tell, you can tell that John's a former civil servant, because basically his message at the beginning was, you're supposed to speak a lot longer, why haven't you taken out your allotted time? But don't worry, I can string this out. Let's start with the first question from Ella, which was about this issue we need to keep the tax burden down to remain competitive, but everybody wants to spend lots of money, and this is indeed the reason why our national debt is still rising at a time when normally at this point in the economic cycle you'd expect it to be falling, and in one sense, it hasn't really mattered up till now because interest rates have been ridiculously low. And so financing that national debt is quite easy. But you don't have to be terribly imaginative to think of a world where, say, long-term interest rates went up from, at the very long end, from about sort of 1.8 to 3%. And that starts actually, GDP is 2 trillion. That means the national debt must be getting on for 1.8 trillion. What's 1% on 1.8 trillion? I'm not going to get into mathematical calculations, but the one thing I do know is that this could be scary. And what I would really want to avoid, and I'm sorry, I don't want to sound like the former Treasury official that I am. This is sort of conversation I would have had with Alistair Darling and George Osborne on quite a regular basis, is you don't want to find out that you've got a debt problem when it's too late. Because the thing about long-term interest rates is they tend to be incredibly stable for very long periods, and then suddenly the market moves against you. Now, I'm not saying we're going to get back to the 1970s where we end up in the hands of the IMF, but we are entering quite dangerous territory. So coming back to political leadership, I do think we need a more honest conversation about some of the pressures on spending. One of the good reforms, both in the UK and in Scotland, has been the introduction of independent fiscal councils who provide independent forecasts. This sounds boring, but actually it's been a really important development. If I look back to the late 2000s, so much time was wasted arguing about the forecast. Because obviously if you have an optimistic forecast, politicians don't have to take the difficult decisions. We now at least have those independent councils. And what is more, I'm not sufficiently au fait with the Scottish one, but the Office of Budgetary Responsibility in London does 50-year projections. Those projections are very clear that the demographic time bomb begins to really hit us in the coming decade. This is the point when the old folk begin to really account for a large proportion of the population. And so I am in no doubt there will be pressure on pensions, on long-term care, and on the NHS. Now, I don't have any, I'm not some sort of slash and burn type who just thinks that everybody should fend for themselves, but I would be arguing that there should be a special tax for social care, and it shouldn't just be paid. National insurance just falls on working people. It's time the old folk made a bit of a contribution, albeit on an income-related basis. It's that sort of conversation. I think it is possible to have political leadership on this. I can remember Gordon Brown in 2001-2 leading a long debate about how the NHS needed more money, and on the back of that, he increased national insurance for everybody, both employers and employees, and it's one of the few tax increases which wasn't particularly unpopular. So it's just time the politicians were straight, I think, with the British people. And it may be that other areas have to be cut back. But if you don't actually put the cards on the table, you won't get any decisions. And the problem at the moment is with, certainly in Westminster, it's very difficult to get a majority in favour of anything. Such is the uncertainty, which actually is a good segue into the third question or point statement from David, which was about the solidity of the Tory DUP alliance. Now, I've been arguing with my son about this. My son's a Corbynite, and he's been convinced that the government will fall, very quickly. And I think he was at Glastonbury in the summer where Corbyn said that the government will fall by Christmas. Well, maybe it will, but they're only 42 days till Christmas, so we better get out and do some shopping. But the point is, the DUP and the Tories need each other. The DUP, all their Christmases have come at once. I've had to deal with the Democratic Unionist Party over many years. every year, one of those sort of strange things that prime ministers always think, especially once they've been in power for a bit of time, that they're the people who are going to solve the Northern Irish problem. And then they do deals with Sinn Féin and DUP, and always at the end of that process, the answer was that the Treasury, or rather you, the taxpayer, should come up with an extra £500 million, and then it would always be all right. And then, so we pay the £500 million out, and then the whole thing would start again the following year when these parties would be back for more. And so the DUP are very adept at this. And, you know, they are in this brilliant position where they've got maximum leverage. They will not throw that away easily because, you know, very few election results give the DUP the balance of power. As for the Conservatives, you're absolutely right. There are massive divisions within the Conservative Party, but again, they've got a massive incentive just about to hold it together. They may be a vote of confidence against Theresa May, but no doubt the Tories will find somebody else to be Prime Minister. But I don't think that will trigger a general election. And this rather strange law, which provides for 5-year parliaments, unless the government of the day chooses not to have a 5-year parliament, actually is quite effective in keeping governments in power if they don't want to have an election. And I just don't think the Tories will want to have an election. So I fear, and I do fear it, because I'd love to have, I think it's Mrs May what she used to call a strong and stable government. I'd love to have one of those. But we've got 4.5 years of pain before the next election. So, and I mean, the other point I'd make is, I mean, John and I worked through the John Major government of 92-97, which lost its majority, you know, pretty much halfway through that parliament. It didn't really have a majority anymore. But it's amazing how governments can survive, and how they survive is doing very little which will upset anybody, passing very little legislation, and just staying in power. And coming back to, I mean, the other point you made was about the Irish border. You're absolutely right. I don't see how, I mean, there's all this fancy stuff about you can have WYSI computer devices to allow trade, people and trade move freely. You know, Sweden and Norway probably have some of the most advanced technology in the world, and they don't seem to have cracked that one. Canada and the United States, you know, you think they'd be good at this sort of thing. Well, they haven't cracked it either. So I'm not hugely optimistic. And if we end up doing a free trade deal with the United States, things like chickens moving across the border will become a serious issue. So you would think, under rational circumstances, that here is Northern Ireland, which voted by a good majority to stay in the European Union. You'd think when the economy, the success of the Northern Irish economy hinges on reasonably free trade across the border, that the main party of Northern Ireland would be arguing that we should stay in the customs union. But that is to take the view that the Democratic Unionist Party regards the world the same as you and me. They don't. Chris, Madrid, Catalonia. Yeah, I mean, anything is possible. I mean, I suppose that if Scotland has, I mean, the difference between Catalonia and Scotland is, I think the British state has always had a slightly different attitude towards national self-determination than Spain has. And I think many people have been slightly shocked by the sort of brute force of the central state in Spain. Nevertheless, I mean, it'd be interesting what would have happened in the UK if the SNP had declared UDI. You know, would we have all just sat down in London and said, you know, go ahead, make our day? I don't think so. But if if Scotland were to become independent, I think it would reflect it would reflect the will of the people in another referendum. I'm not saying there's going to be another referendum or that people even want a referendum in Scotland, but let's just say there was one and Scotland voted to become independent. I think if the London government recognised that outcome, which I think it would, then I would suspect other countries would recognise the outcome. And if Scotland then applied to join the European Union, yes, Spain would be slightly worried about Catalonia, but I think if a sovereign country applies to join the European Union and is eligible, I think the European Union would see some attractions in having Scotland in. A Scottish pound, if there was a Scottish pound, it would undoubtedly fluctuate. That would have implications for savings, living standards, and so on. But then, becoming independent does have consequences. And it's quite difficult to... You could at least theoretically seek to align that independent currency, say, with sterling, in much the same way as Denmark does in terms of linking the Danish kroner to the euro. But I think the critical point I'm making is I don't think you could maintain a monetary union and say there would be some currency risk. There may be opportunities, for all I know. But I think, either you're independent or you're not, and if you are independent, perhaps the most important expression of independence is having your own monetary policy. You can then decide to, join the euro or whatever. But I just don't think a painless currency union will be on offer. Attractive. I can totally see why the advocates of independence, it deals with it. It's a bit like, saying we're going to keep the Queen. You're trying to make independence seem as unindependent, as undifferent as possible. But I think, in reality, the Scottish government would have to face up to it, rather like Ireland faced up to it in the 1920s, albeit in a context where everybody was still on the gold standard, and actually the Bank of England in those days was relatively happy to maintain a currency union with the Irish pound. Yep, I think that covers the questions.
I think so. Maintaining your track record of avoiding any controversial statements. I think the first question I jumped over last time was there, and then the second one there. And a third one at the back in due course. We're getting to the point where you have to be fast now if you want to catch one of these threes.
Hugh Andrew. One thing that was not discussed this evening was the European Union itself. And that, of course, is not a monolith that has not been changed by what has happened. And on the east of the European Union, we have the rise of a succession of rather dubious authoritarian regimes. We have the return of Russian influence. At the heart of the European Union, we clearly have a Franco-German axis committed to further integration. Where do you see the European Union itself going without Britain's involvement in it?
Ewan Brown, what game is Lord Kerr playing in suggesting that he's so cleverly drafted Article 50 that we can come out? And do you think there are any circumstances that actually could happen in 2018? And does it mean that having come out, we could take a breather and then sign another Article 50 letter a year further down the line?
Jeremy Pete. I'd like just to change the topic slightly. A week on Wednesday, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has the pleasure of delivering a budget. You talked about the independent Office of Budget Responsibility and all that. And we already know that the Governor of the Bank of England has declared that the speed limit for the UK economy has been reduced to 1.5%, which was actually fairly generous, given what he said on productivity and what we can anticipate over migration and population change. So how, if you were briefing the Chancellor, would he put together a budget which increases funds for the health service, doesn't raise taxes, reduces the deficit, and deals with the much slower growth rate?
There, Jeremy speaks a former Treasury official. Right. As ever, extremely high-quality questions. Where is the European Union going? I mean, it's very difficult to tell. The one thing is certain is that, in a slightly perverse way, it's just at this moment, well, not this moment, it's just been in the last 18 months that the Eurozone has started performing really well economically, much to the disappointment of the Murdoch, Rothermere, Barclay brother press in Britain, for whom it is axiomatic that the Eurozone is hopeless and bound to disintegrate. Still possible, it might. It is quite important that the European Union takes the opportunity of faster growth, I think, to think further about reform. I think the need for the European Union, in my view, whether we're in it or not, is greater than ever, partly for the reasons you set out. You have a more activist Russia to the east, and we have a regime in the United States which is both unpredictable and, I was going to use the word insular, but certainly it's putting America first. And that means, I think, that Europe needs to be more focused on its security and needs to have a more advanced foreign policy. Now, what also is clear is that the core of the European Union, by which I suppose I mean the old 12 or old 15 minus the UK, has rather different interests and indeed outlook on life from the countries which joined the European Union over the last 15 years or so. And I think it is worrying when you see large marches of ultra-rightists with the support of the government, walking through Warsaw and making anti-Semitic slogans. So my guess is we will see more integration in the Eurozone. That will probably make it less likely that countries like Poland and the Czech Republic will join the Eurozone. But it should be possible to develop the European Union further on the sort of principles of variable geometry, which actually the UK was always very keen on and a strong advocate of. And as I said in my talk, we were, in my view, we were never properly in the European Union. So we had the best of both worlds. But those days will soon be over, which brings me to Ewan's point about our old friend John Kerr and what's his game. Well, I think what John, in a very an impressive media operation, made clear is that when the government says that it's all decided and we're leaving and it's inevitable, that there is actually still a choice. We could, if we so chose, withdraw the letter. And I'm inclined to agree with him. He was directly involved in drafting Article 50, so of all people should understand it. And although, this Article 50 process so far has probably irritated other member states, I still think they prefer to have us in than out. The problem I see is that for Article 50, for us to seek to withdraw Article 50, you'd have to have a majority in Parliament, which was, not only prepared to do that, but would have a clear message of what happens next. And I just don't see that happening at the moment, partly because the Labour Party is led by someone who is probably rather less enthusiastic about the European Union than the leader of the Conservative Party. And, I look back, nostalgically to those cross-party alliances which got us into the European Union in the first place. But I can't see a Corbyn-led, although there's enough people in the Conservative Party, the Ken Clarke, Anna Soubry variety, to provide a potential majority to put a stop to all of this. I don't see Corbyn doing that. I mean, I'm sure he'll be quite keen to win the odd clever victory in Parliament, but he, in my view, remains quite keen to leave the European Union. So there is a wider issue. I think Britain's come rather late to this referendum business, and personally, I can see the case for referendums on the issue of national determination, although I wouldn't encourage people to have them very often because they seem to be pretty divisive. And actually, this referendum's been, perhaps even more than the Scottish referendum. If you look at the Brexit referendum, here we are, almost 18 months on, and people are as divided as ever. And there was this fantasy that there would be this coming together, but I think views have become even more entrenched. And I keep trying to sort of examine my own motives and thinking to, is it the sort of classic confirmation bias that, I want to stay in the European Union, we're leaving, so I'm clinging on to things which may be wrong, I don't know. But I don't see, the reason I think we will leave the European Union in the end is it requires firm leadership. It requires someone to get into power who is then prepared to have a really very grown-up conversation with the British people, probably have another referendum. And, looking at potential future prime ministers in Parliament, there may be someone there who has those talents, but I haven't spotted them yet. My view remains that that John is right in principle about Article 50. Where I would tend to part company with him is that I just can't see any basis on which any government is going to withdraw it. Having said all that, since we're not going to get a trade deal, there's no way, and actually there's some signs today that the government's beginning to brief that when they said that we were going to get a trade deal by March 29th, 2018, what they really meant was they'd get heads of terms. Well, it's an interesting question in this context, what heads of terms means. And since you won't have a trade deal, to all intents and purposes, we will stay in the European Union after March 2018. So, anything is possible. But my gut instinct is it's almost as if we've got on some train to a destination which most of us are pretty unhappy about, but we can't get off that train. I may be being defeatist. Now, Jeremy Peat, what should we say to the Chancellor of the Exchequer? I think the one thing which appears to be certain is that there is a massive problem with productivity in this country, and until we make progress on productivity, there's going to be very little revenue around. And I don't think our political class have quite been prepared to. I mean, Mark Carney and the OBR may have been quite clear on this, but politicians who always have to tell you that actually it's all going very well and that Britain's doing very well haven't quite explained that problem yet to the electorate. I hope that Mr. Hammond will begin to explain the problem in his budget. In an ideal world, this would be that, this is the first budget of the Parliament. It may not seem it, but this is the first budget of this Parliament. Back in history, this is always the defining budget. Whether it was Lawson in 1988, even George Osborne in 2010, or I'm trying to remember, Gordon Brown's budgets in 97 and 2002. This is a point where normally you take the radical decisions because you know that if you're going to do anything unpopular, people with any luck will have forgotten about it in 5 years' time. But my worry is that that Mr. Hammond isn't even able to do that because he simply won't get a majority through Parliament to support those necessary decisions. So, fortunately, in the short run, revenues actually are up, but I don't think that's going to continue. So you have got this problem that the government keeps saying it's going to close the deficit, but it never quite does. In any sensible world, we would be thinking about what taxes need to rise and what spending needs to be cut. As I say, I think there are limits to how much you can go on having state pensions rising at a faster rate than the earnings of those people who are working. But has any of our main political parties in Scotland or indeed the UK said that to anybody? No. And my guess is they won't. So it's not a helpful backdrop to the budget. But Mr. Hammond may know something I don't, and I'd like to think he'd sort it all out. But I fear that he won't.
Okay, there were 2 questions at the back that I missed last time, and we'll take the 2 down here to make a bunch of 4, which may be the last bunch we have time for. So I can't, I don't have the memory to know which 2 hands at the back I missed last time, so gone. Oh, well.
Had enough.
Okay, well, in that case, we'll go 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. Married Leslie, a retired diplomat. You reminded us that it's the government's policy to leave the customs union with a view to signing its own trade deals with other trading partners. You also reminded us of some of the problems, steroids in beef, chlorinated chickens and so on. But you intrigued me with a throwaway line that there might be some trade deals that would actually be better than the status quo. And I was intrigued. I wondered if you could tell me what they were and whether they're with any sort of major trading partners as opposed to, very minor ones.
So two, one behind the other here.
Ian Ritchie, could I just touch on the Paradise Papers, which I suppose you might think of as an economic issue, but it's also a political issue. The fact that sort of old Quaker businesses like Cadbury's and Boots don't pay any tax anymore, and we have to pay VAT, but Lewis Hamilton doesn't. And all these things are organised in British dependent territories. What's the answer to this? What's the solution?
Andrew Bolger, journalist. If we are stumbling towards a sort of hardish Brexit you envisage, you said it would be less advantageous for the service sector. in that case, how is the City of London and the financial sector in Edinburgh going to fare if it loses benefits like passporting rights into Europe?
Right.
They're getting easier, aren't they?
They are. Trade deals, customs union. Obviously, half our trade is with the European Union, so there are limits. I mean, if you accept that that's a net negative, which it kind of has to be, if you leave the single market and the customs union, trade will not grow as quickly as it has done. There are places around the world. I watch the travels of Dr. Liam Fox, who pops up in places a very long way away, like Australia and South Korea, and the countries in question make positive noises, which you as a diplomat know doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get some fantastic new deal. I'm in no doubt that actually if you started from scratch with a trade deal with Australia and New Zealand, you might get some cheaper food. The EU does impose pretty high tariffs on agriculture, and so I think there will be some benefits there, but they're going to be very small. There's a reason we don't trade very much with Australia. It's a very long way away, and New Zealand's even further. But I think you can make some headway. South Korea, Japan, China. Once you get to big countries, it's the point I made earlier that big countries have an uncanny knack of screwing smaller countries. And one of the benefits of being in the European Union was that you were a trade bloc which had to be reckoned with. Now, Mr. Trump made very positive noises when Theresa May went to see him with such alacrity when he was elected, and they held hands. And clearly, Mr. Trump doesn't like Angela Merkel, but the US Congress is a pretty protectionist outfit, and the US have always used trade policy as a sort of instrument of US economic power. And the one reason why there's never been a proper free trade agreement between the EU and the US, even in the good times when the Democrats were in charge, was because of agricultural interests in the States. And this issue of chlorinated chicken is serious. And actually, scientists tell me that there's nothing wrong with chlorinated chicken. But actually, I think the British people, it's quite interesting the way Michael Gove has positioned himself on some of these issues, because he was a firm Brexiteer, but he keeps saying that agricultural and environmental standards are going to be even higher after we leave the European Union, which actually makes getting some of the benefits of these trade deals quite difficult. So, as I said, there will be benefits, but I think it will be with relatively small trading entities. And as an economist, I can't see those benefits outweighing the costs. You can fantasize about it, but it's just not going to happen. The Paradise Papers. This issue of getting tax in is really difficult. I know everybody always sort of thinks the government's being hopeless with these footloose multinationals, and it's not Rwanda trying to get the revenue in. If you look at most finance bills these days, they're about 600 pages long. They include 500 pages of anti-avoidance provisions. They reflect extensive international agreements at OECD level to try. I mean, there's some long exercise called the base erosion and profit shifting regime. Clearly, the right thing to do is try and address it at an international level, but in the modern world, whether it's Uber or Amazon, or indeed Apple, where is the value being created? And how, as a relatively, I mean, by most standards, we're quite a big country with quite an efficient tax system, but in the end, it is very difficult to prove that the value is being created here rather than elsewhere. And you mentioned British dependent territories. I couldn't agree with you more. I spent a decade working for Chancellors who had no sympathy at all. I mean, the idea that sort of Gordon Brown, Alistair Darling, even George Osborne sort of could give the proverbial toss about Gibraltar or the British Virgin Islands or wherever, they didn't, and they don't. And we have tried very hard to beat them all up, and but with varying degrees of success. Now, I know I'm sounding really defeatist, but there is a reason for my defeatism, namely that the one country actually which can have relative success in this area is the United States, if it could get its tax system looking halfway sensible. But even they have stuck with a ridiculously high corporation tax rate for so long that US corporates, pay very little of this tax. And it's one reason, although Jeremy Corbyn went into the last election proposing that we should increase the rate of corporation tax, just, forget sort of ideology, just in terms of tax efficiency. Taxing capital in the modern world is very, very difficult. And I think we've just kind of got to face up to that. And that's why, speaking personally, I support the reduction in corporation tax because, in a sense, it's facing up to reality. It gets us ahead of the game. Actually, corporation tax revenues have been incredibly buoyant in Britain, I think partly because of the reduction in the rate. So, look, I want to keep the pressure up, but we shouldn't give up on tax havens. And if we could reach some international agreement where we could sort of bypass them once and for all, that would be great. I just don't see much sign of that happening. Finally, Andrew raised the point of services and the financial sector. I think this is a problem. I know various trade bodies representing the financial sector have suggested and indeed drafted potential financial service treaties between the UK and the EU. I think getting a really deep agreement on financial services is going to be incredibly hard. Look, the moment you leave the single market, you move from a really very advantageous, not perfect by any means, but a functioning system where banks and asset managers can really operate across borders quite efficiently. Once you leave the single market, that becomes very difficult. And although it pains me, there is a view in in Europe, in particular in France and Germany, that the Anglo-Saxon countries were partly responsible for the financial crisis. I mean, actually, the German and French banks were equally responsible because they bought all this crap, which the subprime merchants were churning out. But I don't see France and Germany regarding access to London's capital as some massive priority. And in a different world, especially a right-of-centre government like we have in the UK, might have prioritised the City of London. I mean, it seems like a very long time ago, but if you remember the deal which Cameron and Osborne secured before the referendum to put before the British people, some of it was providing, clarity on the British financial sector's access to the European Union. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that the people who want to leave the European Union are now so obsessed with leaving the European Union at any cost, and so I was going to use the word deranged, but I think that's a bit too extreme. But so confident are they that it's going to be such a great economic success, come what may, that when it comes to it, they're not going to waste a lot of negotiating capital on financial services. And the sooner those of us who work in the financial services sector face up to this and plan around it, and I work at least part-time in the financial service sector now, so I speak with some experience, the better. I mean, the British government is not going to solve this problem. There will be consequences, and the financial sector needs to adapt. Now, some bits of the financial sector, it really won't have much of an impact, but some areas it will. And in the case of the global banks, they're really making decisions. They're already building optionality into their future plans. Just as, last year, people made a big thing about Nissan making their next model in Sunderland. Well, they were always going to do that. They were quite far down the road in terms of investment. So it was, to use the cliche, a no-brainer. But I tell you, if the supply chain begins to break down and getting through Dover takes 5 minutes longer for each lorry bringing in consignments, the pattern of trade will change.
Okay, I think I can let one lucky person have the last go at exploring next views. There you are.
No affiliations. You said it looked inevitable that Scotland would leave the EU on the same terms as England and Wales. So my question is, given that the Scottish Government have said that they would much prefer to stay in the EU, and in every one of the 32 local authorities in Scotland, people voted yes, do you see any scope for the Scottish Government negotiating a slightly different arrangement, particularly on the residence and employment of EU nationals?
Well, as I say, I can totally understand why the Scottish Government would want to have a... I totally understand why the Scottish Government would want to have a separate deal, because Scotland has different needs from London. Although, funnily enough, actually London and Scotland, are as one in their belief that we should stay in the European Union. But I just can't see this happening. There is going to be, the EU is very clear that there could be separate arrangements for Northern Ireland. Whether the government will choose to take up that opportunity remains open to considerable doubt. Once you start negotiating separate arrangements for separate entities within one nation state. And although, Scotland is a devolved nation, it is still very much part of the United Kingdom. I think it just gets very difficult, and I don't think the Westminster government is going to prioritise this, and I don't think, in the end, the EU will. And someone mentioned Spain earlier. I think Spain also would be disinclined to support measures which showed that one part of a nation state was different from another. And I mean, the reason why Northern Ireland is so different is because the Republic is still in the European Union. And, the EU is deeply aware that Brexit could be very damaging to the Republic, and so wants to do all in its power to help it. And, there just isn't the same advocate for Scotland as there is for Northern Ireland. So I think the Scottish Government will end up being disappointed. I mean, it's been interesting, though. Scotland did vote by a large majority to stay in the European Union, but I've been surprised that it didn't. That Scotland's views not being reflected in Westminster's position on the EU doesn't seem to have stirred a great sort of nationalist outcry in Scotland. I don't know why that is, or whether it could change, but there seems to be there just seems to be sort of grudging acceptance, I think, in Scotland of this is where it's going. I was in a queue in Boots this afternoon in Princess Street, and the man in front of me in the queue was complaining about all this Brexit stuff and just said, why can't you just get on with it? And I think that's actually what I think the broad mass of the British people are just really bored with the whole thing. They can't understand. I mean, it is so complicated, the sort of things about free trade areas and customs unions and single markets. I just think everybody just expects the politicians to sort it out, which actually is another reason why it was a really bad subject to have a referendum on, because it's, whether you become an independent nation state, simple, everybody can understand that. But, what on earth the counterfactual was in leaving the European Union, we still don't know.
I think that gesture is probably a good point on which to conclude, Nick. I don't think I can remember a speaker who's ranged quite so widely in both in what they said and in their willingness to field whatever was thrown at them. In the range of questions. So we're enormously grateful for that. We're enormously grateful for your resolute refusal to sit on any fences that might have been available to you in tackling the range of questions. And I'm particularly grateful to you for acting as a kind of trailer for some of the things that we have coming. Straying into the territory that Jane Francis would normally occupy, I can tell you that John Kerr will be here in the first half of 2018 to answer the question, what are you playing at? And I hope that others of our speakers will pick up tiny threads of the huge territory that Nick has covered for us this evening. So thank you, Nick. Thank you again to Baillie Gifford for making it possible to have this evening's stimulating event, and glasses of wine await you. Thank you, Nick.